Why the Soviet Union went bankrupt, the crisis that shaped the 20th century. We often recall the cinematic moments of the Soviet demise, the exhilarating teardown of the Berlin Wall, the final agonizing descent of the hammer and sickle flag over the Kremlin, or the desperate kilometer-long queues for basic necessities that defined life in the late 1980s. These images, dramatic and searing as they are, capture only the symptoms of a monumental historical failure, not the root cause. The popular narrative tends to frame the Soviet collapse as primarily an ideological defeat, a political surrender to the democratic West, or a military exhaustion brought on by the costly arms race. But if we look beyond the political theater and the visible protests, we encounter a far colder, more compelling, and ultimately devastating truth. The Soviet Union, the largest and most ambitious planned state in human history, did not fall primarily because of tanks or dissidents. It collapsed because it was defeated by its own ledger. It was a superpower that went bankrupt. Imagine a state that possessed enough nuclear firepower to obliterate the civilized world several times over, yet struggled chronically to produce enough simple consumer goods or even feed its own population without massive grain imports from its ideological adversaries, the United States and Canada. This catastrophic contradiction, a monolithic military structure built upon a fundamentally broken financial foundation, is the central riddle of the late 20th century. For decades, the Soviet system excelled at mobilized production, rapid industrialization in the 1930s, the monumental effort to win World War II, and the initial triumph of the space race. But the moment the global economy pivoted toward continuous, decentralized innovation, information technology, and flexible finance in the post-war era, the centralized Soviet structure stiffened and froze. It became a colossal, inefficient engine designed for a race that had already changed tracks entirely, operating on increasingly obsolete technology and relying on sheer resource brute force rather than intelligence or efficiency. This documentary is not focused on the political dissolution. It is an autopsy of the invisible architecture of debt, subsidized failure, and concealed statistics that corroded the system from the inside out. We are going to explore the implacable mathematical reality that the final Soviet leaders inherited, a reality carefully masked for decades by central planners who prioritized manufactured output quantity over any genuine measure of economic efficiency or quality of life. The system was never designed to generate wealth. It was designed to mobilize, hoard, and redistribute existing resources. And when the flow of those essential resources, particularly the critical revenue stream from high oil prices, began to dry up catastrophically in the 1980s, the entire structure revealed its terrifying fragility. To understand this financial implosion, we must travel back past the era of perestroika and glasnost, deep into the mid-1970s. This decade was the definitive turning point, the moment that the system's fatal addictions became irreversible. The USSR was attempting to maintain an enormous, globe-spanning empire, funding proxy states and allies in Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Europe, and across Africa, while simultaneously bankrolling an unsustainable arms race against the West. All of this required constant, incredibly expensive maintenance, an artificial global equilibrium sustained only by external revenue. When the oil prices were astronomically high in the wake of the energy crises, the system could cunningly mask its inherent flaws, effectively using petrodollars as a global lubricant and a domestic subsidy mechanism. When those prices cratered, the facade slipped instantly, revealing the deep, festering wounds of industrial stagnation, agricultural incompetence, and a crippling dependency on foreign credit. The story of the Soviet collapse is often taught solely as a lesson in political history, a triumph of democracy over communism. We argue that it is more accurately the definitive case study in catastrophic economic planning, a financial breakdown that fundamentally reshaped the global order and unleashed many of the forces that continue to define our modern geopolitical landscape. Understanding precisely how a nation of such immense natural resources and military strength could declare effective bankruptcy is crucial to understanding the power dynamics that emerged in the ensuing decades. If you appreciate deep-dive documentaries that reveal the intricate, often unseen financial and economic mechanisms beneath the major historical events, and if you are ready to explore the chilling arithmetic that ultimately brought down an empire, then please take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Your support ensures we can continue to uncover these definitive, financially driven narratives. We're about to look at the internal accounting books of the Soviet Union, and the numbers, unlike the rhetoric of the Cold War, simply do not lie. Building upon the revelation that the Soviet financial structure was inherently flawed, we must now delve into the microeconomic realities that guaranteed its failure, regardless of global oil prices. The fundamental operating principle of the centrally planned economy was the soft budget constraint. Unlike firms in market economies, Soviet enterprises faced no genuine threat of insolvency. If a factory failed to meet its production targets, if its goods were shoddy, or if it ran up astronomical costs through inefficiency, the state, acting as the sole owner and financier, simply absorbed the losses. There was no mechanism for creative destruction. This systemic distortion fostered a pervasive culture of waste. Managers were incentivized not by profit or quality, but by the sheer volume of output, often measured in simplistic metrics like weight or length. Consequently, a nail factory might produce needlessly heavy nails, or a glass factory might produce ridiculously thick panes simply to meet the tonnage quota. Furthermore, without the pressure of competition, enterprises routinely hoarded critical resources, labor, raw materials, spare parts, far exceeding immediate needs, creating artificial local shortages even when national stocks were adequate. This internal bureaucratic friction acted like grit in the gears of the economy, slowing down every single step of the production process and rendering national statistics on output wildly misleading regarding actual utility or value. Crucially, while the official price indices remained stable, a cornerstone of the Soviet claim of economic superiority, the reality for the citizen was one of continuous, crushing hidden inflation. Since planners could not raise prices openly without admitting failure, they resorted to a silent form of theft, quality degradation. A television set might maintain the same nominal price for a decade, but the components used would become cheaper, less reliable, and more prone to immediate breakdown. A new, slightly redesigned version of an old product, often functionally identical but labeled with a new name, allowed the state to introduce a higher price point, masking the constant erosion of purchasing power. The consumer, armed with a fixed salary, was perpetually paying more for less utility, creating a deep, corrosive cynicism toward the state's economic pronouncements long before any political dissent became visible. This internal fragility was compounded exponentially by the constraints of the Soviet currency system. The ruble was not convertible. It could not be exchanged freely on global markets. This non-convertibility meant that the vast industrial output of the Soviet Union, its tanks, its tractors, its steel, was essentially worthless for acquiring sophisticated technology, high-quality consumer goods, or essential grain from the West. For all practical purposes, the USSR was forced to operate as a raw commodity exporter in the global arena. Its ability to modernize its infrastructure or feed its population was entirely dependent on its capacity to sell hard resources like oil, gas, gold, and timber for hard Western currencies, primarily the US dollar. This structural dependence on volatile commodity markets meant that the entire geopolitical superstructure was built upon an economic foundation as shaky as the latest crude oil futures price. Another crucial layer of financial strain came from the economic maintenance of the Soviet bloc itself. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, CMECON or COMECON, was designed to integrate the economies of Eastern Europe, but in practice it functioned as a massive ongoing subsidy program funded by Moscow. The USSR provided its satellite states with essential raw materials, particularly oil and gas, at prices far below the global market rate. Conversely, it often purchased the finished goods from those satellites, which were frequently of inferior quality, at inflated, artificial prices. This arrangement, while politically necessary to maintain the Warsaw Pact and the ideological buffer zone, represented a colossal, invisible drain on the Soviet budget, effectively taxing the Soviet domestic economy to prop up its allies. Now, consider how this systemic generosity, or rather geopolitical necessity, functioned when the primary source of hard currency, oil revenue, vanished. It became an instantly fatal liability. Was the cost of maintaining empire inevitably destined to bankrupt even the most powerful nations, regardless of their political structure? That is a question worth deep reflection. If you find these intricate financial mechanics of history fascinating, please take a moment to comment below and share your thoughts on whether any modern superpower faces a similar hidden financial trap today. Drawing these disparate threads together, what emerges is not merely a chronicle of political mismanagement, but a terrifying case study in systemic, structural inevitability. We have seen how the internal logic of command economics, prioritizing mobilized scale over efficient production, acted as a slow-motion corrosive agent. It fostered an environment where the absence of financial accountability meant that every factory, every collective farm, and every bureaucratic layer was a hidden sinkhole for state resources, accruing an unquantifiable yet utterly real internal debt against the future productivity of the nation. This was the silent cancer metastasizing within the economic body, long before the visible symptoms of empty shelves and political dissent became undeniable. The weight of this contradiction, the demand for global parity in military and geopolitical theaters, set against the system's fundamental inability to generate genuine, sophisticated wealth, created an unsustainable pressure differential. The centralized machine, while adept at brute force extraction and allocation, proved entirely incapable of adapting to the rapid, decentralized complexity of the late 20th century. It was an engine running on steam and iron in an age demanding silicon and agility. This structural deficit meant that the entire edifice of superpower status, the vast global network of alliances, and the enormous standing army had to be financed not through surplus value derived from efficient labor, but through the continuous liquidation of natural assets, and critically, through the fickle kindness of external commodity markets. Reflecting on this journey so far, we grasp that the moment the primary external revenue stream faltered, the internal rot, previously contained by political coercion and subsidized pricing, was instantly exposed to the harsh light of global scrutiny. The Soviet Union was not simply running out of goods, it was running out of credit. It was running out of the hard currency necessary to lubricate the gears of empire and the basic functions of the domestic economy. The vastness of its resources became irrelevant when those resources could not be converted efficiently into the currency of global power and trade. The system was trapped in a feedback loop. Inefficiency demanded greater subsidy. Greater subsidy required more external revenue, and the reliance on external revenue made the entire structure hostage to forces entirely beyond the control of the Kremlin. The ultimate failure, therefore, was not ideological, it was arithmetic. It was the moment when the balance sheet could no longer be falsified, when the debts owed to foreign banks and the internal structural deficits converged into a single insurmountable liability. The political reforms introduced in the late 1980s did not cause the collapse. They merely served as the X-ray, revealing the skeletal decay that had been ongoing for decades. The state, stripped of its capacity to coerce and unable to pay its bills, had no mechanism left to enforce unity or maintain its vast domain. As we pivot towards the final reflection, the implications of this economic implosion extend far beyond the immediate dissolution of the USSR. This was the largest sovereign bankruptcy in modern history, a financial cataclysm whose ripples redefined geopolitics, unleashed new forms of global capitalism, and created the economic realities that defined the post-Cold War world. It is the definitive modern lesson in the brutal, non-negotiable power of economic reality over political aspiration. The final act of the Soviet drama was not played out in the streets of Vilnius or atop the crumbling Berlin Wall, but within the sterile, unforgiving columns of a balance sheet. What we have witnessed is the slow-motion detonation of a system that mistook resource mobilization for wealth creation, a historical delusion that eventually proved terminal. The great Soviet experiment, designed to overcome the inherent chaos of capitalism through rational centralized control, ultimately succumbed to a far more profound chaos, the inability to calculate true value. They could count the steel beams produced, the barrels of oil extracted, and the number of missiles deployed, but they utterly failed to account for the cost of stagnation, the value of innovation, and the crushing expense of inefficiency hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic reporting. This story of insolvency serves as a chilling universal parable, far transcending the Cold War. It teaches us that political ideology, military might, and even control over vast natural resources are ultimately insufficient to sustain an empire if the underlying economic logic is fundamentally broken. The Soviet Union's collapse was the ultimate demonstration that scale without efficiency is merely weight, and that power built on debt, both internal structural debt to the future and external hard currency debt to the present, is inherently transient. The great irony is that the state dedicated to the destruction of capitalism was, in the end, defeated by the very arithmetic it sought to abolish. The immutable laws of supply, demand, and solvency proved more powerful than any 5-year plan or thermonuclear arsenal. The legacy of this colossal bankruptcy continues to define our world. The sudden vacuum left by the Soviet financial withdrawal created opportunities and instabilities that persist today. From the emergence of oligarchic capital in post-Soviet states to the geopolitical tensions over resource control that were once subsidized by the Kremlin. Understanding the mechanics of this financial implosion is essential, not just for historians, but for anyone seeking to decipher the deep currents of modern global economics. It reminds us that even the most seemingly monolithic structures are fragile if they ignore the demands of productivity and accountability. The true measure of a nation's strength is not its capacity for destruction, but its sustainable capacity for creation. This historical moment compels us to look beyond the immediate headlines and consider the hidden financial infrastructure supporting our own modern institutions. Are we, too, masking structural inefficiencies with temporary resource booms or excessive debt? Are we prioritizing immediate, measurable output over sustainable, qualitative growth? The Soviet failure offers a stark warning. The greatest threats to stability often come not from external enemies, but from internal, unaddressed mathematical realities. If the meticulous unraveling of these invisible forces, the financial and economic architecture beneath monumental historical shifts, captures your imagination, and if you seek to understand the cold, hard logic that shapes the world, then I strongly encourage you to subscribe. Join us as we continue to dissect the financial histories that empires are built upon, and ultimately what causes them to crumble. The true practice begins now, the disciplined reflection on how the past's economic failures inform the choices we make today. Let us continue this journey, armed with the knowledge that in history, as in finance, the numbers always tell the final story.